Breaking the Cycle to Step Forward. Authentic conversations from lived experience and a professional perspective in overcoming abuse with Chris Tuck and Beverley Ann.
Hello and welcome to Breaking the Cycle to Step Forward. I'm Beverley Ann and I'm joined as always by my lovely co-host.
Hi everyone, Chris Tuck here. Hope you're all well.
And today we've got a wonderful guest. All our guests are special, and Linda, our special guest today, is from the Survivors Trust. Hello, Linda.
Hello there, everyone, and it's an absolute delight to be here today. Thank you for the invitation.
No, and we've been wanting you to come on here for a while, so I'm really pleased that it's able to happen on this episode. So, Linda, do you want to give a quick overview as an introduction on yourself so our listeners and viewers can get an idea of who you are?
Right, yes. Gosh, how long have you got?
45 minutes, Linda,
Yeah,
maximum.
right. I better make a start then. If your listeners haven't gathered by now, I have got a very Yorkshire accent. I was born in Yorkshire, in another generation as well, and that's certainly going to come through on the podcast today. But of course, I actually left Yorkshire when I was about 9 and spent a great deal of my life living in the West Midlands, in particular Warwickshire, in the Warwickshire area. But I've also lived in South Africa for 5 years. In fact, different parts of the UK. I do like traveling around. So that's a little bit about me. I was married at a young age. I've got 2 grown-up daughters. I've got 5 grandchildren, and I've even got a great-grandchild. Now, go on, tell me I don't look old enough.
That's amazing.
You don't look old enough for the great-grandchild. We will give you that. Definitely. You look really good.
Thank you, Chris. I'm fishing for compliments, so apologies.
No, don't apologise. We'll keep them coming, Linda.
Yeah.
Great stuff. So yeah, that was very much my growing up and what have you. I do have lived experience of abuse. I grew up in a very abusive family, and what I mean by that, growing up with a dominating father who was physically abusive, and also emotionally and psychologically abusive, and most of the abuse happened on my dear mother, God bless her. But of course, as a child, my earliest memories was 3 years old, of my first trauma, which it still lives with me decades later. And that's one of the key points I do want to get over about abuse, is that whenever anybody experiences some form of an abuse, it's not just the person that it's focused on. There's other people around too who are impacted. And by the way, I did directly experience physical abuse, psychological and emotional abuse, but my mother got the worst of it. And that stays with you for a long time. And the other difference is, again, I hear from time to time people say, oh, well, children won't be too badly impacted. They grow up and they move on. No, that's absolutely not the case. I grew up and I escaped that environment. I got married very young, and I think a lot of that was to do with the fact I wanted to escape the family, but I was fortunate to find the most amazing, gentle person, husband that could be. But what I will say is my mother stayed with my father till her death. So I've been living in that environment. My father passed away 2 years ago, and I'm in my 60s. So, this is indicative of many families. Not everybody leaves that environment, and that's, I find, very sad, especially in today's age that we live in, because there are so much more options than were available to my mother when we were children.
Absolutely. And Chris,
Yeah.
that's something you've experienced too with your parents, isn't it? With your mum.
Yeah, it is. And I wanted to pick up exactly what Linda's just said. So I grew up in 3 domestic violence households with different caregivers at different stages. But my mum stayed with she managed to leave my real dad, my biological dad, when I was 7. but then the man she went to replace him with, and they were both called the same name, by the way, which was even more confusing.
Yeah.
But she died at she died in the relationship with the second person, and he abused her right up to the end. And we tried to get him into court for the abuse of us, but it just didn't happen. So he's still abusive, always will be abusive. And my mum was still with him, because she said, better the devil she knew than the devil she didn't, Linda.
That's what my mum was like, and she always said when we were young, when you're grown up, I'll leave, and she never did. When we were young, she did try leaving, by the way. We grew up, you know, in the 60s, and there weren't refuges like there are today. My mum she had 4 of us, all one after the other, stepping stones. She went back to her dad, and she grew up in abject poverty. She was one of 13 children. And her dad said, you've made your bed, you lie on it. And that was very much that kind of thinking in those days. You know, you've got to go and sort out your marriage. And, you know, it's always like the pressure is on the woman to make it work, even though she's, you know, you're working with an abuser who has to have everything on his terms. And of course, she was abused right until the end. In fact, the night she died, he abused her. I actually had, it was just really, really bizarre at the end, because she went very suddenly in the middle of the night, died of a heart attack. I'd gone round to see her, and the last words to me that night before were, I'll have the kettle on, which a lot of Yorkshire people say, I'll have the kettle on. And I was so looking forward to seeing her, because I was travelling over from Lincolnshire at the time. And when I got there, the ambulance was there and she'd gone. When I went back home, because I was doing the arrangements for the funeral, getting prepared and all of that, I went back home, there was a voicemail on my telephone, which I hadn't heard when I'd left the home that day. And it was my mum sobbing down the phone on the night that she died, saying he'd come home from the pub and he'd attacked her again. And she was just so distraught. And that was my last,
Wow.
you know.
Sorry.
Yeah. Oh, no, I mean, it happened. It's what it was. It was really difficult for me. I think that was probably the angriest I've ever been in my life, because I lost it. When I heard that message, you know, I absolutely lost it. And I did face him, and I, you know, let him have it. Everything that I felt from a child upwards, I did do that. It was a bizarre relationship, because it was he truly believed it was like Romeo and Juliet with his relationship with my mum. He truly believed that theirs was a loving, lasting relationship, and it was absolutely abusive on every level. And he couldn't see past that. When she died, he was bereft, is his words, and he was, you know, I could see it. But I also believe a lot of it was anger as well, because he couldn't control that element of her. That it was really bizarre. And I even said that to him, you're only feeling sorry for yourself because you could not control the fact that she's gone now. And in my spiritual thinking, she's in a better place. She's in a safe place, and you know, she's okay now. And I keep telling myself that as well.
And Linda, thank you so much for your courage there to share that, because there'll be so many listeners that resonate with either being part of or watching parents, siblings, etc., being part of that abusive background, and yet the abuser not even able to recognize it or acknowledge it in any way, shape or form. So thank you.
It really is, it really is a bizarre thing with abusers, because they often see themselves as a victim as well. And again, it's very difficult. I do think some of it's mental health. I do think a lot of it was his brain was pickled, and I say that in jest because he was an alcoholic, and how he managed to last 17 years after my mum is an absolute, you know, shock, really, because we thought he would have gone much earlier with his abuse of alcohol all his life.
No, thank you. So obviously when you left the home, oh, Chris, you've got something to say before we move forward?
I have. I didn't know that our conversation was going to take this path, and that's the beauty of this
Yeah.
podcast and conversation, Linda. So I just wanted to pick up a few points there that you were sharing. Obviously, we're not blaming any woman for not leaving.
Yeah.
We're not doing that. We're just explaining the reality of the situation from our perspectives. And my mum was in the relationship with also an alcoholic, and I don't think he ever saw that he was doing anything wrong either, even though we pointed it out to him all of the time. And when we pointed out to mum what was being done to her, she was like, but he loves me. And we're like, well, that's not love. And she didn't want to hear it. On one point said, well, this is abuse and you should be sticking up for us, you're our mum. So we would actually say that to her. She would turn around and say, well, no one protected me when I was young. And I'm like, hang on a minute, this is just all wrong. It's just like, and I'm sure we're not the only ones having these kinds of conversations with our loved ones. The dynamics of family are very complex, and they're very dysfunctional at times, aren't they?
Oh my goodness, on so many levels, Chris, and I totally agree with you. Like I said, my mum did try. My earliest memories of mum was always fighting back. He used to have strangle her to unconsciousness, hold her up against a wall. My dad was 6'2", a muscular. He was a tradesman. So my mum did try to escape, but every time she did, he went and fetched her back, and it was much worse. And she got to the place where it was a self-defense mechanism to be complicit. And you know, with the trauma responses and friend, I often say that, you know, the fight, flight, friend, freeze, flop. Well, my mum started off with the fight and the flight. She did that many times, and every time he got her back. But by the way, she was doing that even when I was in my early 20s and married. She come to me and I took her in, and my dad kicked the door down. He was he did not care if the police were going to arrest him and nothing like that. What my mum tried to do is, in her mind, she thought she was protecting us by saying, look, it's easier if I just go back. I can deal with this. I don't want you dealing with it. You've got your own life to lead now. And so as the years went by, she went into friend, and she used to do some techniques to keep him complicit, because she knew what he was like when he come back from the pub 7 days a week. And she had some quite funny strategies, what she used to do, but I wouldn't be surprised if many other people have done similar things.
Absolutely.
Always making sure his dinner's ready, his favourite meal, cooking him his apple pie with his custard. Oh God, all of that, knife and fork on the tray, the remote control, everything's calm. And even in the summer, she'd put the heater on, because she knew he'd fall asleep when he'd had his dinner, and then he'd be out cold for the rest of the night. Now, if she didn't do any of that, he would come in, everything would be up in the air, and he'd be on a rant and an attack mode. And so she realized she could deal with this. Every now and again it didn't work, and he would come home and again go back into that, but life was much easier, she thought, by just being complicit. So and it's really hard, because I can't criticize any woman that does that. I'm different. But I've not lived the life my mother lived, and it would be wrong of me to criticize any woman, because I always say it's a unique journey. Everybody's different. Everybody's got their own net. And so she had nowhere to escape to, you know, so that's, you know, really.
And I don't know your dad, but it's very common as well for abusive men in this case, to be very well liked outside of the family home. So when you try and say something, everybody feeds back the good things.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a really good strategy that these abusers have, because I know for my dad, he was very popular down the pub, but I noticed he always aligned himself with men who had got no kind of ambition, nothing. So he was kind of superior amongst them men, and that them men, their marriages had failed, and he was the, you know, an amazing husband because he managed to stay married for decades. And so he always aligned himself with men who were like him, who were alcoholics, who had no aspirations. My dad, by the way, had his own business, earned excellent money. It all went up against the wall.
Yes.
My mother lived in abject poverty. I mean, you won't believe the state I found her on the day she died. I was so angry about the state. She hadn't had a new bed in 25 years, and it was, you know, he just wouldn't replace anything.
No.
The house was kept literally bare. She had nothing, bless her, nothing.
Yeah.
Oh,
thank you,
Before
Linda.
we carry on, because obviously this is quite heavy to start off straight away, but it's the reality of what we all were brought up in. So around my mum's death, Linda, my hospital, because we had an ongoing police case in the last year of her life, and I didn't know it was the last year of her life, but she'd been ill with lung cancer, and we found out from someone outside of the family that mum was in hospital and it was serious. Phoned the hospital, so I found all the hospitals around where I knew she'd been previously, and she wasn't in any of those. And basically, cut a long story short, I missed my mum dying by 5 minutes. We, you know, my husband phoned my stepdad because I couldn't speak to him, and said, like, what hospital is she in? And he refused to tell us. So then the hospital phoned me and then said, oh, just to let you know, your mum passed away 5 minutes ago. So you can imagine the anger and the upset that all caused.
I bet.
And then when it come to burying her or having her cremated, we couldn't go there because we had an ongoing police case against them all, and it just wouldn't have been right. So we said, oh, we'll go and see the flowers afterwards. He even took the flowers with him. He wouldn't allow us to have any of that, and he still got my mum's ashes.
Oh,
so
gosh.
We've got he's controlling right to the end. So when people say, oh, you know, these individuals do not exist, they do, and they're nasty.
Absolutely. And it's that, you know, a leopard doesn't change its spots.
No.
And even if these abusers go off and have other relationships, it will show through those tendencies. It's very difficult for them to hide that mindset, this superiority over others, and this attitude that the selfishness I can't get my head round, that you see in a lot of these abusers. So absolutely. And by the way, Chris, I'm so sorry to hear that, because that must be so frustrating for you as a family, not being able to, you know, have your mother's ashes.
It's very complex, because I don't want to go on for long, but my mum was an abuser to some of my siblings as well. So it's very complicated, and some of my siblings just won't give her the time of day. But I was able to see the victim that she was as well, whereas they don't care. And again, I acknowledge how they're feeling, and I don't tell anyone how they should feel, but then I feel what I feel. So they can't tell me how to feel or not to feel either. I don't condone what she did, and I don't condone, but you have to find your own peace with this, don't you? So it's how you find that for yourself. So I wanted to just share that with everyone.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. And just to be aware, Chris, you just keep freezing every so often. So I know you can change over how your Wi-Fi, so you might want to do that, because we've got away with it so far, but I think you're frozen at the moment. So whilst you're just doing that, Chris, we're waiting for you to join us. Linda, So thinking about in your adult life, we mentioned earlier that you work for Survivors Trust currently. Can I ask, was this something that when you started work, you were thinking, I'm going to be in this area of making change with abuse, both sexual and domestic, or was this something that happened organically? What was your pathway?
Yeah, a really bizarre one, Bev, because I never planned to end up in this sector doing what I do now, and it just was by chance. So early years, I started off working in the legal sector. I worked there for 10 years, managing tribunals and complaints against lawyers, and got a great deal. That's where I got my training in management and so on, and managed large teams. But then I kind of got to a bit of a place where I don't know what it is, and we all go through it, don't we? A transition as you get older, where you start to look back and you think, I want to do something more than this. I want to work with real people, with real situations. So I did end up working for a disability sector and thoroughly enjoyed it. It was amazing. I managed a very busy national helpline service, working with people with disabilities, but also families and carers. And that's where I was blown away by the amount of abuse on some of our most marginalised members of society, and shocking cases that I couldn't get my head around sometimes, of abuse on people who had no way of defending themselves. And you know, so every form of abuse, you know, I've noted whilst we were managing that service. And then one day, when it was only, funny enough, when you know, my mum had died, that my daughter, I wanted to get back closer to where they were at the time. I was living in another part of the country. My daughter found a job managing frontline rape and sexual violence support services, and she went and got an application form for me. She said, Mum, this is right up your street, because she knew how passionate I was about abuse generally. And I completed it, and I'd missed the deadline to for the interviews, and I thought, oh well, you know, close but not, you know, it's not to be. And I am very positive. I think if it's not meant to be, it's not meant to be. Never gave it another thought. And then the next thing I know, I'd been away on holiday, come back and got a call saying, would you, you know, we've interviewed all the candidates and nobody was suitable. And having looked back, you've got all the skills, experience that we're looking for. Would you like to have an interview? And I thought, why not? And I went there, did it, and I got a call the same day saying you've got it. And it was just really bizarre. And I've never looked back. I feel I've really found my niche in life. I don't know. I sometimes think, how did I get here? It's just bizarre. But I absolutely loved it. So I was managing frontline services, managing advocates, those independent sexual violence advisors, managing helpline, peer support groups, counselling, therapy, all of these types of services. I really was proud of the fact I really believe in person-centered services that are fit for purpose, and services that survivors look for and what they want, rather than, you know, sort of ticking a box. And that's always been my focus, is making sure that we're meeting the needs of survivors and not listening too much to the funders who have their own sort of idea of what a service should be. And I don't mean in any way, shape or form that standards, quality, all of that must be present in no matter what it is you're doing. Of course it is, but you know, I believe in survivors participating in decision making about, you know, how things should look, what looks like a good service, what would meet my needs. And just as examples there, listening to parents of survivors, especially parents of children who've been abused, and listening to them really made me recognise how there's a lack of support for many parents. You know, I used to do some focus groups. I've done them on behalf of the Survivors Trust, running focus groups to give feedback to National Health and so on, National Health Services. And I was just amazed because I'd never seen it from that perspective, how parents are actually suffering with vicarious trauma.
Absolutely.
First of all, and nobody actually picks up on that, and they feel that they're completely just, they don't even know how they're functioning, because they get told this news that their child has been abused, and they don't get given much in any kind of information and support. And I really thought that's completely wrong. Parents, you know, non-abusive parents have a right to know, get help themselves, get therapy if they want it, or advocacy support, but also just knowing how to work with their child and help them to cope and recover, and help the rest of the family cope and recover. Because I always say, when with sexual and domestic abuse, when you've got a victim, it's a bit like the dominoes. You line them all up in a row, and the front domino is the victim survivor. But if you knock that person over, that is the point where it all comes tumbling down, because all the other dominoes, the family, the friends, those who love and are non-abusive, they too come tumbling down and need support and help. And so I'm a big believer in making sure it is, you know, it is done. And just as an example, I remember one mum saying to me, I didn't even know what words to say. Talk to my son about what had happened. I just couldn't get my head around it. I didn't know what was right or was the wrong way. You know, she said, and it really scared her. And also parents go through a huge sense of guilt. Even though they had nothing to do with the fact that their child was abused, but you know, they're thinking of, I should have, could have, would have. I'm sure we all have said and thought that, don't we, in those situations? So yeah, it's heartbreaking. I've heard heartbreak, and this is from fathers as well as mothers. Heartbreaking stories.
Absolutely. And is you know, your passion and your drive certainly comes through, Linda. You know, it's coming straight from the heart, and that's what we love, especially on here, because you know, our listeners, our viewers can resonate with that, you know, from whichever place that they're standing. So thank you, Linda. So how did you get to go towards the Survivors Trust? Because what you do at the moment is amazing, and I'm speaking as someone who's also participated in that training and learned so much for myself.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say that, Bev. Well, I mentioned I went to work in frontline services, and I worked at Rosa in Rugby, Warwickshire. And the CEO of the Survivors Trust was a trustee there, Faye Maxted, lovely Faye. And Faye and I just immediately struck up a really strong professional relationship, but also friendship, I would say. I've learned a lot from Faye over the years, and we just are on the same level when it comes to the passion to improve effective and efficient responses to anyone who discloses abuse. So Faye, when I got my background in training anyway, as a manager working in the legal sector and so on, she very quickly sort of collared me into, Linda, could you in your wildest dreams find time to deliver the independent sexual violence advisor training? And I agreed to that. I manage this for myself, so I felt very passionately about what services should look like, and in the development of the program as well. So I did that, and I did that until 2021. And then I kind of moved into another part of training now, because it's got so big now, the training. The training team's expanded. We've got another trainer, a couple of trainers in now, Helen and Vicky. Helen and Lucy. And we've got personnel there supporting us with all the coordination and what have you. So I now cover all the bespoke training that's requested, because initially the training for the Survivors Trust was always with member services, always with frontline rape and sexual abuse support services, training their therapists, their ISFAs, their managers. But we've had many other sectors coming to us, and I've absolutely really enjoyed that part of the work. So it's now evolved into a place where I'm training frontline police officers, all types of medical staff, medical practitioners, midwives, doctors, dentists, gynecologists, all different types. I also train the private sector, do a great deal with the private sector. Many companies, big global companies, come to us now asking for help with sexual harassment in the workplace, which is a massive, massive thing, especially since the Me Too movement. People now are realizing they can come and speak out. And so I do a great deal of training of HR investigators, managers, senior managers, and so on. So it's the education sector, great deal of work with universities, schools, colleges, oh God, you name it, prisons, probation services, you name it, it's all there. Local authorities, I'm training all different personnel.
And it's so much needed, because like Chris and I are always saying about, you know, the reason why we do this podcast is to open the conversation, but also to break the cycle. And the only way we're going to break the cycle is to be able to cross over different areas. And I think one of the key things that came across for me when I participated in one of your trainings was, you know, we say, you know, abuse in the workplace, sexual and domestic. Now, I've been in HR meetings before, and independently from any company, but they're HR meetings. And for instance, there was a line manager who said the challenge he has is in personal development sessions is when people overshare. So I questioned what oversharing meant to him. I should say that person. And it was like, well, they're talking about abuse that's happening at home, whether it be sexual or domestic. And that's very separate to work. And I was like, if someone broke their leg, would you not be trying to support them in ways so they can continue their work effectively? But you're saying that they're oversharing when you're asking them to trust you in their own personal development. And this was only 10 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
So now to be able to see that we are finding ways to be able to support people without digging too deep, but, you know, signpost in whatever way, I find is amazing. And some of the information that I learned from you as well blew my mind, because we look at things in a different way. So I think, you know, and I think this is going to resonate with people. One of the things you shared was about a person that's continually late or goes off sick. And what we naturally do. So we naturally think, oh, they've let us down again. Let the team down. But there's something else you say about that, though, Linda, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's often something that's never questioned. You know, when people are, you know, you see a pattern evolving where they're either regularly late, they're keen to get away on time from work, turning up with injuries perhaps, and sort of saying, oh, I've walked into the door and nobody questions it. All of these kinds of things where, and also even a change in personality as well, Bev. You remember we talked a great deal about people, especially younger people who may move into a new relationship. They may have worked for an organisation for a while. People know them, they know their personality, but then they've gone into a new relationship, and as the weeks and the months go by, you start to see a change in that behaviour. Like they might have liked to wear a lot of makeup or some makeup, and all of a sudden they're not wearing any makeup. They might look unkempt, whereas they've always prided themselves on what they look like. All of these things, and it could be vice versa as well. You see a change, and these are things to consider, you know, when we think, oh, is everything all right? Especially if they start to be withdrawn, and they're usually quite an outgoing person, a happy-go-lucky person. You start to see changes, and they're very subtle. They don't all happen overnight, but week by week, month by month, and you can see that. And this is, and it's not about being nosy. It is not. It's not about people intruding on people's personal lives, because I'm like that. I'm happy to share what I'm happy to share, but there's also parts of my life that's totally private, and I wouldn't want to share that. And I think it's important. People should feel they don't have to share everything, and they and it's just simply to say things aren't great at home. Okay, something of that. And that should be the mechanism where people can then think, right, so we don't need to hear a full disclosure. We've heard what they've said. We can just be that listening ear. We can just be there to acknowledge and validate that we're sorry to hear they're going through this. Is there anything we can do to help? And again, making sure it's an empowerment model of support. So we're not taking control, you know, we're not going, right, you need to do X, Y, and Z and all of that. Because the minute you start to do that, you put pressure on them. And don't forget, for some of these people, they might not even be ready yet to, you know, when people start saying, well, you need to leave him, you know, well, that's very easy for somebody to say to another person. But for that individual right now, they might be having other worries in the background, like, well, I can't leave because I'm financially, you know, dependent on this person. Who's going to pay the mortgage? Who's going to pay the rent? I can't do it on my own. What about childcare? Again, people don't realise that abusers, in some circumstances, they are doing some things that the victim's dependent on. And they might not have family that can step in and do it all. And then they start thinking, will I lose my job? Again, all of these prevent people from being able to tackle the issue in a way that they're ready for, and it's proportionate when it's in their time. But steps are being taken to help them to manage this.
Absolutely. And, you know, I don't mind sharing. I remember a time, mine wasn't around domestic abuse, mine was around sexual abuse. And there was someone in the company, shall we just say, and he was an older man that wasn't a manager by qualification, but was considered a manager because the amount of years he'd been in that position. And I was a very young girl in my early 20s, and I hadn't disclosed. I'd only disclosed to one person at that time that I was a survivor of sexual abuse. So it was very much a time where I was still trying to keep that lid on that box. But every time I was on my own, when he went to leave the building, he would pat me on the bottom. And there was a time when I was literally standing against the wall, so he couldn't do it. And he was fighting with me to get it. So I made the excuse. I was very young, made the excuse, and I spoke to one of the other salespeople, and I said, could you just have a conversation with him and tell him that I'm sensitive? That was the only thing I could think of, you know, not to do it. I got called in, and he actually happened to be a Yorkshireman. He was the actual manager, very, very high up, and it was in construction industry. And he called me in and he said, Beverley, I understand you've had an incident with such and such. And straight away I went, oh, I don't want to cause trouble for anyone. I look back now and I think, wow. But you know what he said? He was amazing. He said, Beverley, let me tell you. First of all, I want to hear what you've got to say. So he asked me. He said, secondly, you're not the first person. He's already had an official warning. He will be losing his job now. And at first I was like, I don't want anyone to lose their job. He said, that's not your responsibility. That was his.
Yes,
now
absolutely.
I'm 60 and this was in my 20s. So what an amazing man. And the last thing he left me with was, I don't care if it's the CEO of any company. Never let another man put you in that position. He said, and if you were my daughter, I'd be saying a bit more. He said, so let's just leave it at that. So I just want to put that one back, because that was my experience of a company like 30 odd years ago. But it hasn't evolved like that in a lot of companies. So with the training that you're doing, you're really really opening that conversation in different ways, aren't you?
Yeah, and it's lovely to hear your story there, Bev, because that is what I would say is perfect. If we can get more men like that who stand up and call it out for what it is, and whether managers, but also men who've got no power at work, they might be, you know, seen as junior staff. If every man was to stand up and say, that's not right, that's wrong, it could really make a difference, because I do say that abuse, it can happen to men and to women. It can happen to anyone, by anyone, although we know that predominantly abuse is carried out by men and boys on women and girls, and it is gendered. They do it because they are women and girls, and that's how they see women and girls as less important, as second-class citizen. But I just think that as much as there are these bad people out there and bad men, bad examples of men, there's some amazing men out there that can really make a difference. And I have spoken to some men who feel very angry about what's going on with these abusers, because they themselves have their own children. That, you know, they say, I've got a sister, I've got daughters, I've got a mother. Couldn't bear the idea of anybody hurting them like this. But on some occasions, I get them say, I feel a bit embarrassed because it feels like it's a woman's world, this sector. And I said, well, it shouldn't feel like that, because yes, whilst the vast majority of the victims coming forward are women and girls, men and boys also experience this, but we also want men and boys supporting these issues, because I think they can make a difference. I think they can give, I'm just thinking of those cases where I've worked with some women who have absolutely no faith in any male to be kind, treat them with respect, and treat them as an equal. And I just want those women to be able to experience that there are good men in the world, that not all men are bad men. And I think that, I always remember a young fella saying to me at a university many years ago, he was a staff member working in the gym, and he came up to me and he said, thank you for that talk. He said, it was amazing. He said, I found it really helpful. But his mannerisms, he was so softly spoken, quite shy. And he said, it's wonderful that you've given us this training to the staff. He said, but I don't think anybody would ever come and disclose to me because I'm a man. And I turned around and goes, well, I would. And he sort of like looked at me and he goes, pardon? I said, I would. I said, I've just spent a few minutes. I said, I noticed you in the audience, because he was on the front row and he was absolutely riveted. And I said, your persona, everything about you, it feels gentle, it feels safe. We want more people like you sharing that with other men, helping, whether it's women or girls, whether it's men or boys who might disclose to him. One thing for sure, I've often said that when I've worked with other male professionals in my sector, I experienced child abuse, whether domestic and sexual abuse as a child. And I know that not all men are bad. This is my personal journey. I was fortunate enough to be married for many years to a wonderful man, and I've met some amazing men out there. And for me, the idea of disclosing to a male who I feel safe with, who I feel could protect me, I think is so important. Yes. And I don't mean protect me physically, I'm talking psychologically and emotionally, that sense of safety that you can have. And one of the things that always resonates with me, I introduced a male counselling service when I was managing a frontline service. And the first female to opt in to have a male counsellor was a young Asian girl. She was 18 years old. And I was so excited because I'd done a risk assessment and I'd asked her, would she prefer a male or a female counsellor? She said, oh, a male. And I was like, oh, could I ask why a male? Because I'm quite excited about this new service from men. And she was so eloquent in her response. And she said, you know what's happened to me? I know if I sit with a woman, she's going to tell me what I want to hear, that it was wrong and it shouldn't happen. In order for me to have any faith and move forward in my life, I need to hear that from a man, from a good man, a man who will give me faith that I can still have my future life ahead of me. She'd planned she wanted to go to university. She planned she wanted to get married. She wanted to have children. She says right now that all of that is not in my periphery because I can't trust any men that I'm going to come in. So having time with a male counsellor, and my goodness, it really did fabulous outcomes that we've had from women who spent time working with a male counsellor.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you. And Chris has been so patient because she's had her hand up for a while. I can see that. And for anyone listening, when we're recording this, we have a little silent hand signal that allows us to not over talk with each other. And Chris, you have been patient there, sitting on your hands, literally.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up a few things that Linda said. So when we were sort of like speaking about signs and symptoms, in inverted commas, of people who might be going through something at home, i.e. leaving on time, maybe being late, maybe being absent, maybe turning up with marks on their body, whatever it happens to be, there's parallels with this with trying to identify abuse in children as well. And it's often the change in behaviour that we need to be picking up on if there aren't clear signs and indicators of abuse. And you shared that very eloquently, sharing with us all the different ways that it can transpire. But also I was thinking about, as you was explaining about who a victim can be, I know of someone who, I don't want to give it away, so I'm using this person in mind, but I'm changing some of the details. High up in financial services, has grown up kids, has sort of split from the partner, and the partner lives outside, but because the partner pays some of the mortgage, thinks they have an automatic right to go back to the family home and demand sex whenever they want it. And this person can't always say no. And we've tried to point out, friends in the circle, that actually when you don't want sex, it's rape.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of myths out there, Linda, that there can't be rape within marriage or within a consensual relationship. But if you don't want it, and if you say, even if you don't say no, but you don't want it, and they keep badgering you, and you've been in like that coercive, controlling relationship, it is, there's nothing else for it. It is rape at the end of the day. But there's a lot of people that can't recognize it for what it is, and they also don't have the courage to say no or go to the police and report it. So I just wanted to bring that up as well, because you might be having individuals within your workplace that may be going through that example, and people go, oh, that doesn't happen, but it happens a lot. There's many of my women friends that I speak to, and they say, oh yeah, I just give in and just whatever. But this particular one was like, if you don't want it, no is no. And also what I wanted to pick up on is, you were saying like fight, flight, freeze, flop friend, and that the person that you were talking about, your mum, she thought there was a bit of flight in there was probably a bit of freeze and flop, and then the friend, so she's gone through the whole gambit of response, the stress responses, the trauma responses. And I don't think people often pick that up, that many of us will go through the gambit of trauma responses, and not one is right or wrong, it's just right for the time and the circumstance. So I don't want anyone listening to this thinking that because they weren't strong enough, or because they couldn't say no, or because that any of this is their fault, because it just isn't. The way that we respond in the moment for whatever the particular incident is the way we respond. But when you go through the criminal justice system, you often get picked apart for your response.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and this is, and I'm really there with you on that, Chris, because there is a lack of understanding about why we respond in the ways that we do to trauma. And it's absolutely normal. And again, the science of this is a fascinating subject. It's one that I deliver training on to the police, because the police often don't understand why victims behave the way that they do. And one of the classic examples I gave is of a young woman with the amygdala, which is a part of the brain. It's our that part of the brain that scans for any kind of warning signs that something is about to happen. And the minute that each and every one of us have our amygdala triggered, and it's triggered by what we see, what we hear, what we smell, touch, feel, so on. Whatever it is, we will respond in a certain way, but we don't have hindsight. And this is people who criticize victims for, oh, well, you should have done this, or you should have done. Well, that's called hindsight. That's called a plan. People don't plan that they're going to be raped, or, you know, when they're walking down the street or what have you. So we all respond, and that's why it's called the survival brain, because that's fight, flight, and freeze and flop is surviving. It's our body telling us, do exactly what you have to do to survive this experience. You will survive it if you do this, rather than everybody always being quite critical of victims, because people seem to think that a real victim is one that put up a fight. And yes, that does and can happen, of course it does, but I'll tell you now, most victims don't do that, and that's because of what the amygdala, their brain, is telling them how to react in a split second, not having a good old discussion about it in your mind, and you do exactly that. And I've seen it actually physically happen when I think I mentioned it in the training, Bev, around the young female walking down the street when an attacker came up very quickly behind her. And you could see on CCTV how she stood frozen because she could hear the footsteps approaching her quickly. That was in her statement to the police. I could hear fast steps approaching me. I stood still. And then she said, as I turned to look around, an arm touched me. His arm was on her shoulder. And he whispered into her ear, do everything I tell you and you'll be okay. And so she went into friend mode because her amygdala told her, don't try to fight, don't run. Why did her amygdala say that? Because what you couldn't see on camera is what he had a blade between his thumb and his forefinger on her neck. And her amygdala could sense, she said in her statement, I could feel the cold steel on my neck. So her amygdala saying, don't try to fight, don't try to run, because you could have more injury. And people often don't understand the science of the brain, but it is indeed a survival brain. So never, to all your listeners out there, don't go putting any pressure on yourselves. Don't feel bad, shameful about what you did to survive. There is no right or wrong answer to surviving. You do what you have to do.
Absolutely, Linda, absolutely. And I really don't like saying this. We are over our time, actually, but I haven't wanted to stop anybody. So before we go, because we like to make sure that everybody listening or watching, from whatever perspective they're looking at, they know if there's something they resonate with, they can ask us questions, and I'll give the email address in a minute. But Linda, from your perspective, anyone listening at the moment to this podcast and they recognize themselves as maybe a victim or survivor of abuse, sexual, domestic, whether it be in their own home, whether it be in work, any environment, what would you say to them and where would you signpost them? But also to anyone within a an employer or a manager or anyone within the workplace who would be interested in more information and about becoming an advocate, actually, and supporting others, what would you say to them? How would you signpost them?
Yeah, thanks, Bev. Well, what I would say to anybody listening who is in this situation of either domestic abuse, sexual abuse, and what have you, please don't be alone. Okay, don't keep this to yourself. Don't hide it. It's not something to be ashamed of at all. You've done nothing wrong. Get help. And everybody's circumstances will demand a certain way. So, for example, somebody who lives in where there's a potential of honour-based violence, they might not want to go and tell somebody else in their community. That could put them more at risk. So find somebody outside of that community, whether it's a friend at work, a work colleague, your manager at work, or even your doctor. Go to see your doctor and explain to them what's happening and that you want to get help. Okay, so don't be afraid. Not everybody may want to report. So first of all, everybody has the right to report it to the police if they are being abused. But I do know that there'll be some listeners who think, oh my goodness, I just couldn't do that. I'm not ready for that. So it's looking for those support mechanisms that can help you. So if you're struggling with domestic abuse, you can be put in contact with an IDVA. An IDVA is an independent domestic violence advisor. They're free services and they operate across the country. And how can you find an IDVA? Well, there is a national domestic abuse helpline that you can contact, or you can just Google it. Just Google the National Domestic Abuse Helpline. In addition to that, every local authority has an independent domestic violence advisor. So you can go on your local authority website and they'll have domestic abuse. There's usually a tab on there. You'll go through on there and find yourself some support. There are charities that provide domestic abuse support services, again, local ones. Now, I can never remember all these emails and these website links and what have you, but the enough.campaign is a government website and it's got a vast amount of information on there for victims and for professionals to learn more, but loads of signposting for every community type as well, every protective characteristic. There is some way, shape or form of finding support. As well as the Survivors Trust as well, we have a national helpline service number, and I don't have it on me at the moment, Bev, but if you could put that out at the end, because I can't remember where I've put it. I thought it was.
Don't worry, Linda. We will include it.
Thank you, thank you.
We will include it in the some of these website links underneath this session, but also underneath the video as well.
Excellent, lovely.
Thank you so much. Go on.
I was just finding, just to say, for the Employees Against Abuse, any managers listening in or any personnel who thinks this would be suitable for their place to work in, please have a look. If you have a look on the Survivors Trust website, and we have an Employers Against Abuse page on there, and they can sign up for it online as well. It's all done through the web, signing up for it. And I hope that we do see you there. We've still got some spaces left. We're carrying on into the spring of 2025. So do go and have a look at it.
Thank you, Linda. And Chris, what are your last thoughts before we finish?
I know we've got to wrap up quite quickly. So what I wanted to say is that if you're triggered or triggered by anything that we've said today, then please just use your grounding techniques and tools that you might have heard us describe in previous podcasts. And also, if you want to give us any questions or discuss any points that we've raised, then please put them in the comments or email us, and Bev will give you that in a moment. But what I wanted to say really is we've used a lot of personal experiences today, and that is really just to bring to life that it doesn't matter what you do for a job, whether you're professional, a mum at home, we can all be victims, male or female. Any one of us can be a victim of this. So let's just forget about the taboo. Let's just have an honest, open conversation about all of this so that we can get solutions in place for many more of us that need and deserve the appropriate specialist support.
Thank you. And for anyone listening, You can contact us by email, BreakingTheCycleToStepForward@gmail.com. Thank you so much to Linda for coming on and all the work with the Survivors Trust. We did mention, or Linda mentioned, Faye Max did. Faye's also been on here as well. We've had a few people from the Survivors Trust, so please listen to those episodes, and thank you so much for listening. Goodbye for now. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.